My name is Dina Miller, and I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political lives of their communities and to strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I'd like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or any other devices that will make noise. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer period. Please wait for the microphone before asking your question. Tonight's speaker, Elaine Weiss, is a Baltimore-based journalist and author whose articles and last book, Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army, have been featured on C-SPAN, NPR, and in Smithsonian Magazine Online. She holds a graduate degree from Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University and has previously worked as a Washington correspondent, congressional aide, speechwriter, magazine editor, and university journalism instructor. Tonight, as part of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Ms. Weiss will be giving a bookmark series talk on her new book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. The Woman's Hour has enjoyed overwhelmingly positive critical reception, including winning the 2019 Silver Gavel from the American Bar Association, and has been optioned by Steven Spielberg's production company, with Hillary Clinton signing on as an executive producer. She will talk about the book and the struggles that suffragists faced during the ratification process tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elaine Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here tonight, especially. This is a very special evening. This is the 100th anniversary of New Hampshire's ratification of the 19th Amendment. So congratulations. When I saw that it really was the day, I was actually very excited because it marks New Hampshire's participation in this extraordinarily difficult social movement and political accomplishment. So I want to tell you how this came about, because it didn't just happen like that. And New Hampshire plays a really important role in this whole story. Now, I know that this is a special season in New Hampshire. I once lived here. And it's not just the beginning of the school year for the students. It's not just the beginning of leaf peeper season, the invasion of the leaf peepers. It's the invasion of the candidates, because, of course, we are here in New Hampshire in the thick of the primary season for the presidential primaries. And many, if not all, of the candidates will come here to the Institute of Politics, perhaps at this podium, perhaps signing eggs, as I've just learned. And this year, a record number of those candidates are women. And the majority of voters across the nation will be women. And of course, both of New Hampshire's senators are now women. And my book, The Woman's Hour, is the story of how all this came about, how it was made possible that women could enter the political life of our country. So it's a great, rollicking, bare-knuckled political tale. And it's filled with vivid, complex characters and twisty plot turns, if you could believe it. It's a political thriller, that's what it's been called, with strong, complex women as its central characters. You don't often get that. Women as activists, as organizers, as savvy politicians, not just helpmates, not just footnotes. They are the stars of the show. It's a book about political power and political will. which is appropriate for the Institute of Politics. It's about racial and gender politics. It's about states' rights. It's about women's rights. And it's about democracy and our nation's rather ambivalent attitude towards full democracy. It's the story about how American women's demand for the vote, which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically and at great cost finally transformed into a constitutional amendment, into the law of the land. So the Women's Hour is the story of the 19th Amendment, the largest expansion of the franchise in our nation's history, giving the vote to half of the citizens of the United States, who were not included when the Founding Fathers established their government, supposedly by and for the people. The 19th Amendment was not just a legal change. It was not just a constitutional change. It was not just an electoral law change. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the first time. It marked a societal change, a cultural shift about the role and the rights of women in society. And that change, as we know, is still ongoing. The fight for women's suffrage is one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. And it's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate in our government? Who has a voice? When we say, we the people, do we really mean everyone? And we are asking that question again right now. Now, women's participation in politics did not suddenly begin in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. There's a wonderful website that I encourage you to visit called Her Hat Was in the Ring. And it documents and has a biographical database of 3,864 women who ran in 5,241 campaigns before 1920. Now, many of these were at local level, school board, even dog catcher, but they ran. They ran for political office, and this is before most women had the vote. One of those women who ran early, before women could vote, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You've probably heard of her, but not as a candidate. She actually ran for Congress in 1866 from her home district in Manhattan. She ran, as she described it, in order to impress the public with the fact that constitutionally, women had the right to run for office. She received 24 votes out of 12,000. Of course, only men could vote. But she did raise a very hot discussion about women and politics. Afterwards, she said that she regretted only, not that she had run, but that she did not procure the photographs of her 24 unknown friends. New Hampshire's great suffragist, and I was really thrilled to see a little exhibit about that in one of the rooms outside, Marilla Ricker. She was the first woman attorney in the state. She attempted to vote in 1870 and in every election thereafter for the next 50 years. She ran for governor in 1910 at age 70. Her filing papers were refused because as a woman, she was not registered to vote, and so she was not allowed to run for office. Now, Susan Anthony, of all people, understood the importance of women voting and women running for office. And she said, there will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make the laws, and elect the lawmakers. Now, if you're like me, I wrote this book because I did not know how it was that American women won the vote. I knew that at one point in our history, we could not vote, and then at another we could, and I didn't understand what had happened in between. And so my fuzzy idea, which may match your fuzzy idea, was that, again, how did American women win the vote? And that active verb is very important. We were not given the vote. We were not granted the vote. It was a hard and difficult fight for over 7 decades. So the fuzzy idea I have was that a bunch of women gather in a place in upstate New York called Seneca Falls, and they're wearing bonnets and hoop skirts, and it's all very picturesque. And then fast forward, and there's some picket lines, and then poof, American men see the light and grant the vote to their mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters. It's portrayed as the March of Progress. And by the way, that's how it's portrayed in many history books. It was the March of Progress. It just happened naturally. It was an idea whose time had come. No, that's not how it happened. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades to finally secure the vote for American women. And the culmination of that whole crusade came down to one 6-week battle in Nashville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1920. And that's where my book takes place. In the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving the vote to all women in every state, in every election, for the first time. As we know, New Hampshire was ahead of the curve. It had ratified in September of 1919. 35 states had ratified, including New Hampshire, and 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states then in the Union, were required for full ratification. So just one more was needed. And Tennessee could be that 36th state. And I explain in the book why it was not Vermont and not Connecticut, who would have been easy states to ratify, because the legislature was inclined to ratify, but there's all kinds of political pressures on the governors that make it impossible. So it comes down to, of all places, Tennessee. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, it would become the law of the land just in time for the 1920 presidential election, which was a pivotal election, first one after World War I. The nation was really deciding what kind of country it wanted to be. Was it going to be a leader of the free world, or was it going to be isolationist? Was it going to embrace technology or not? Was it going to restrict immigration? That was a big topic of debate. So was racial issues. There were race riots throughout the United States. There was labor strife. A lot was going on then that will seem familiar to us today, and the nation was trying to decide what was its direction, and women wanted to be part of this decision. So if the amendment failed in Tennessee, the suffragists really feared that they would not see the amendment in their lifetimes. It would not be ratified for the foreseeable future. They saw the nation swinging into a more conservative mode. And actually the 1920s are very conservative. We think of the flappers and all, but politically it's very conservative. And they see that happening. And they realize if they don't get it now, they may not get it at all. And those of us who have lived through the Equal Rights Amendment can know that an amendment can get very close to ratification, right on the line, and not make it over the line. And the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced into Congress in 1923. So they were right to be worried that this might not happen if it didn't happen now. By 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years, since that meeting in upstate New York at Seneca Falls. And that's where the demand for the vote was first publicly made at that meeting by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, women had been talking about wanting the vote for a long time, but this was the first public meeting where that demand was to be made. Now, many of those attending the meeting thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too outrageous. It was too radical. They actually begged Elizabeth Stanton to withdraw that resolution. There was a young man in the audience who had driven his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And he stood up and he said, "No, you must demand the vote. You must." And it was a young Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. And he told the assembled men and women that the vote would never be given to women without a fight, as it would not be given to him without a fight, and they must demand it. And so it's Frederick Douglass who convinces the other reluctant participants at Seneca Falls to approve Stanton's outrageous demand for the vote. And he calls himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life, and he truly is. He truly believes in it, and he's, if anything, the great hero of the story I tell. Now, Douglass and the women that we know as the early pioneers of the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Stanton, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, Susan Anthony, had already worked with Frederick Douglass as abolitionists, because these women, before they became suffragists, were actually abolition organizers. And the idea of women's rights, suffrage being just one of those, really grows out of abolition's idea of natural rights, natural political rights. And so the suffrage movement grows out of the abolition movement. And they are twin causes for decades through the Civil War. And the suffragists expect that after the Civil War, women and black men and black women will all be given the vote in a great burst of universal suffrage. But they're sadly disappointed when they're told that, sorry, the nation cannot handle two big reforms at once. And Frederick Douglass sadly told them that black men needed the vote more desperately than they did. It is a matter of life and death with us, he pleaded with them, as violence consumed the Reconstruction years. It's not the woman's hour, Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists told them. The woman's hour must wait. And that's where the title of my book comes from. It was a heartbreaking split, and Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 14th and 15th Amendments because women were excluded. And Elizabeth Stanton said, if that word male be inserted, as it was in the 15th Amendment, it will take us at least a century to get it out. And she was almost right. It would take another 50 years. In anger, Stanton and Anthony expressed vile, racist sentiments against black and immigrant men who were not as well educated as they were. And it took years to heal the breach, though Douglass, Stanton, and Anthony personally reconciled and were quite close. The question of race would bedevil the movement from now on. Now, in the years since Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists had waged over 900 state, local, and federal campaigns to win the vote. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in small towns and big cities across the nation. And you see they begin in horse and buggies at the beginning of the movement, and they're in cars by the end. They had to change hearts and minds about women's role in society before they could even hope to change the law. It was a stupendous feat of organization when you think about it. When the movement begins in the mid-19th century, passenger train travel is in its infancy. There's no transcontinental railroad yet. The telegraph has just been invented. There's no telephone. There's no typewriter. Even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio is not in use yet. So you think of it, they had to do it on foot, on horseback, in wagons, by pen and pencil. So as one young woman, editorial assistant in my publishing house, came into my editor's office, she had read a draft of the manuscript, and she said, "Wow, I don't know how these women did it without Facebook." Well, they did. They held meetings and rallies, and they marched, which was not considered proper for women to do. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And so when you see suffrage reenactors wearing white, or when you see the Democratic women in the House wearing white, it is in honor of the suffragists. Now, today, it's hard to imagine how difficult, how brave a woman had to be to stand up and march, or to stand up in a meeting in Manchester, New Hampshire, and advocate for equality for women. They had to endure contempt and ridicule in their communities, in their churches, and in the press. And we're going to look at some rather strong images that the anti-suffrage campaigners put forward to describe their attitude towards women suffragists. So here, what would I do with the suffragists? Again, it's all about silencing women. Here's another one that's hard to look at. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. In fact, Susan Anthony used to say she could mark the progress of the movement by the projectiles that were thrown at her. So when it was just plain old eggs and no longer rotten eggs, that was a mark of progress. And when it was just tomatoes and not rotten tomatoes, she felt that they had come a distance. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, of course, even Bolsheviks. And here you see this was a poster convincing men not to in a referendum. Again, the suffrage can be given by Congress, a change in the Constitution, or it can be given by the states who are in charge of election law. And so there were constant campaigns in the states to try to get them to change their laws and allow women to vote. Some states in the West, this was successful. In most, especially in New England, it was not. So here's a poster for one of these referendum elections. Which do you prefer, the home or the street corner for women? Obviously, you can be a loving mother, or you can be a political zealot on the streets. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed, she-men, sort of the version of that candidate is not attractive, which we hear today. The men who supported them were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. And again, which one do you think was supposed to be the suffragist? Again, the anti-suffragists claimed that if women were able to vote, or even were campaigning for the vote, they would abandon their families, much like women going out to work were supposedly abandoning their families. So here you see an anti-suffrage cartoon where mom's going out to vote and dad has to take care of the screaming babies. This will be a continuing motif of dad being left with the screaming babies. This is really scary stuff. Okay, here's another one. When women vote and mom is smoking cigars and reading the sporting news, while dad is having to hold the screaming baby and also knit his, or sew, I guess he's knitting, his own socks. And husbands have to provide themselves with new trousers out of their wives' old skirts. Again, the idea men are going to have to do some of the housework and the apocalypse is coming. Here's another one. What will men wear when women wear pants? Again, they were not subtle with their fears about what was going to happen if women won political equality. What would they ask for next? That was the big question. Clearly, they were frightening my favorite anti-suffrage, bed of trouble. This is self-explanatory, I think. In their quest for equal citizenship, the women of the suffrage movement employed a wide range of stratagems and methods, and many of these, marches, which we've seen, demonstrations, picketing, which we'll soon see, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, legal test cases to go to the Supreme Court, would all be adopted by the civil rights campaigns of the 20th and the 21st centuries. They built upon what the suffragists had invented. The suffragists were ingenious and fearless. They had to be. To test the prohibitions against women voting, New Hampshire's Marilla Ricker began voting in 1870. Her ballot was rejected, but in 1872, she joined Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and about 150 other women across the nation who tested the state prohibitions against women voting. So they just went and voted in the 1872 presidential election. Susan Anthony, as the face of the movement, was punished, as an example. She was, here you see a popular magazine, and she is usurping Uncle Sam's hat. She's there with her threatening umbrella. She's often depicted with her threatening umbrella. And she is called the woman who dared. She dared to vote. Susan Anthony was soon arrested, put on trial, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. She had a sham trial. She gave the judge what for, and then she went on a public speaking tour asking the question, is it a crime for a US citizen to vote? Here's her trial transcript. And of course, we're asking that question again right now in our elections. The failure of this voting experiment led Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment which would supersede all the other laws prohibiting women from voting. It was introduced into Congress, what we now know as the 19th Amendment, in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. Every year, the suffragists would go up to Capitol Hill and testify on its behalf of why it needed to be passed, and every year it would be thrown back into a file cabinet. It was voted down either on the Senate or House floor or in committee 28 times. The suffragists, meanwhile, also pursued a long line of presidents to gain their support. They tried every political angle, most of whom, of course, ignored them and wanted nothing to do with them. Here we're going to see some lovely depictions of Susan Anthony chasing Grover Cleveland with her threatening umbrella. And then there's this cover of Life magazine where with her threatening umbrella, she is attacking the Senate. Now, they did get one president before Woodrow Wilson to support suffrage, and that was Theodore Roosevelt, who, when he was running for a third term on the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose ticket, he supported not only suffrage, but also a federal amendment for suffrage. And this is how the press depicted that collaboration. Let's see, is it not there? No, it's not. Okay, well, they did. They showed the suffragists and Theodore Roosevelt on a bed, a kind of throne bed, and the woman is saying, "I'm ready for Teddy." It was quite outrageous. Um, Meanwhile, the suffragists worked in the states because, again, the states can confer suffrage. And they can do this by legislative action or by popular referendum. Of course, again, only men could decide whether women deserved the vote. So it's only men who are making these decisions. Here in New Hampshire, women began agitating for the vote very, very early. They could actually vote. You could actually vote in colonial times. But once the nation was formed, you lost that right. The New Hampshire Women's Suffrage Association was founded in 1868. That is actually quite early, by Armenia White and her husband Nathaniel, who was a staunch supporter of women's rights. And their home in Concord became the center of the state movement. Armenia served as state president until 1895, and then honorary president until 1916, which was the year of her death at age 98. But the year before she died, when she was only 97, she was still active in suffrage politics. And here's a news article that she throws open her home to aid the suffrage cause. Beginning in the early 1870s, again, pretty early, New Hampshire women could vote in school board elections. It was considered that was proper because schools had to do with children and mothers would be interested in children. So school board seemed like a safe bet. That was often the entry point for voting. And from the start, New Hampshire had powerful male allies. When I was reading about it, there are many, many state politicians and legislators and governors and even clergy who publicly supported votes for women, and that was rather unusual. But they also had some very powerful opponents. In 1903, New Hampshire suffragists campaigned for a change in the state constitution, which would strike the word male from the constitutional voting requirements. The Constitutional Convention passed the resolution on to the voters to decide, the male voters to decide. The suffragists mounted a massive campaign. The national suffrage leaders, including Carrie, Chapman, Catt, the president of the association, came to New Hampshire to win approval. There were speeches and rallies and petitions and intense lobbying. One New Hampshire suffragist spoke 140 times before the local granges. 75 ministers preached sermons in favor of the amendment on one Sunday. Still, the amendment was defeated by a margin of 3-2 by the men of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire women did not give up. They kept the idea of women's right to vote in the public mind constantly. Suffrage became a favorite topic of collegiate debate. Here is Dartmouth versus Brown in the 13th annual debate on women's suffrage, with the governor presiding. Suffragists convinced their friends in the State House to introduce bills for some form of limited suffrage. So if women were not going to be given the right to vote for all of their representatives, well, maybe just for their municipal representatives, like mayor, but they couldn't vote for Congress or state legislature or president. So they would try to get something rather than nothing. So every 2 years, they introduced this, beginning in 1905. Every 2 years, it lost. I was reading this 1905, 07, 11, 13. And here again, it just gets defeated again and again. And of course, Marilla Ricker kept on trying to vote. So the only solution for New Hampshire and for many states where men repeatedly refused to give women the right to vote was a federal amendment, which would overtake all of those laws. But it was still stuck in Congress. The slow pace of this progress, now we're around 1913, in Congress and in the states, stirred frustration and anger among suffragists. You can imagine this. It happens in every movement. It's been going on a long time, and there's not much to show for it. A new generation of suffragists, the third generation, grew impatient and no longer willing to wait, no longer willing to ask politely or plead. They are willing to be aggressive, to be rude, disruptive. Have we heard these words recently? Willing to even break the law. The movement split. As reform movements often do, we see this happen in the labor movement, we see it happen in the civil rights movement later in the 20th century, in the gay rights movement, even in the animal rights movement. There's often a split having to do with strategy and tactics. A young Quaker woman named Alice Paul, who had trained with the more radical strain of the suffrage movement in Great Britain, came home to America to do, as she called, blast the movement out of its lethargy. And she splits off from the mainstream suffragists, the National Association, and she forms the National Women's Party. And the Women's Party is willing to do things that not only the suffragists have never done before, but no one has ever done before. They picket President Wilson. And you see here, Wilson is against women. Again, sounds familiar. They protest on the steps of the Capitol and the White House, and they even burn President Wilson in effigy at the gates of the White House. They have signs calling him Kaiser Wilson. This is during World War I, and it's considered not only unpatriotic, but perhaps even treasonous. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists are arrested and jailed. They're held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells in the DC jail and in a prison in Virginia. They're physically assaulted, clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read or write or even speak to one another. They communicate by singing. And when they refused to eat, because they considered themselves political prisoners, they were force-fed with tubes rammed down their noses. To try to break her leadership, they threatened Alice Paul, who's being held in solitary confinement, with commitment to an insane asylum. Of course, they couldn't find anything wrong with her. They were just trying to break the movement. When finally the suffrage prisoners were released, they toured the country in one of the great public relations coups that I've ever read about. This is called the Prison Special. They rented a Pullman car, and they were pulled across the country on a northern route and then back on a southern route. They are wearing tailor-made recreations of their prison uniforms, and they would go from town to town giving speeches and having parades and rallies and confronting the public and saying, we are your wives, we are your sisters, your daughters, and we have been imprisoned for asking for the right to vote. What kind of democracy are we? We have just waged a war to make the world safe for democracy. What kind of democracy are we? And they gained a lot of public sympathy for that. And finally, in June of 1919, and we just celebrated that a few months ago at the Capitol, after World War I was over, the federal amendment was finally passed by both houses of Congress. I should tell you that the senators from New Hampshire were one of the most adamant in the opposition to the amendment. They did not vote for the amendment. It was sent out to the states for ratification in June of 1919. And as in many states, the New Hampshire legislature was not in session. At that time, legislatures often met biannually, every other year. And 1920 was an off year. And so in a lot of these states, the problem was the governor would have to call a special election. And they were expensive, they were unpopular, they were in some ways politically dangerous for the governor. And these special sessions were very rare in New Hampshire. They had not been called in decades. And opponents of the amendment worked hard to make it difficult for Governor John Bartlett, who was a big supporter of women's rights, to call a special session to ratify. And he said at the time, "It is said that if I dare call the legislature together with the consent of the council, they will flay me alive, kill every reform measure passed last winter. This is silly. I will risk all dangers that may come to me. Let us come together briefly and keep our pledges to give women the ballot. No political or bodily fear will stop me for 1 second." Now that's political courage. And the legislature did ratify exactly 100 years ago today. So 10 months later, in the summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory, or possibly defeat, because Tennessee was a dangerous place to be fighting for this amendment. And it was a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for women's suffrage, because almost all of the other southern states had already rejected the amendment, including my state I live in, Maryland, and all with the same rationale, same racist rationale. They did not want black women to vote. And the 19th Amendment does give the vote to all black women. So the Suffs realized that they faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best hope. So the campaign generals arrived in Tennessee. Carrie Chapman Catt, the national suffrage leader and also international suffrage leader. Remember, this is a worldwide movement at this time, and 26 other nations have already given their women the vote, including Germany, who we have just defeated in World War I, including Russia, which has just gone through a revolution. So we were not pioneers in this by any stretch. We were number 27. So Carrie Catt was Susan B. Anthony's protege, chosen by Anthony to lead the movement into the 20th century, and the 20th century. And she comes down from New York to lead the mainstream suffrage strategy in getting Tennessee to ratify. Also arriving that night, that hot night in Nashville, young Sue Shelton White, who is a Tennessee daughter and has left the mainstream suffragists to join Alice Paul. She's become now the leader of the Tennessee Women's Party. She's sent by Alice Paul, sent her home to execute the Women's Party strategy for winning Tennessee over. So now you have two women's groups having the same goal, but working separately, with headquarters in the same hotel. But they do not collaborate, and they keep stepping on each other's toes. So again, a lesson for the future. And also arriving that same night, Josephine Pearson, leader of the Tennessee women opposed to women's suffrage, who comes to defend her state against what she calls the Feminist Peril. Now, Carrie Catt, in my estimation, is one of the great female political strategists and operatives in all of U.S. history. She's both an idealist and a realist. She had no illusions. And she gave it straight to the Tennessee suffrage leaders. And this is what she told them as she was coming down to Tennessee. "Allow me to tell you that no matter how well the women may work or how effective their results may be, ratification in Tennessee will go through the work and the action of men. And the great motive that will finally pull it through will be political and nothing else. We have long since recovered from our previous faith in the action of men based upon a love of justice. That is an animal that doesn't exist." There were powerful forces working against ratification in Tennessee. Corporate corporate, political, and ideological foes, each with their own reasoning for opposing women getting the vote. Politicians who feared this large new electorate. 27 million women would be eligible to vote, and no one knew how they would vote. And they might rock the status quo. So the political parties and politicians were very nervous. Clergymen, many of whom, not all, but many, believed that women's suffrage went against the will of God and God's plan, because he had made Adam to be dominant over Eve. And to question this was against biblical teaching, and they use biblical language to oppose suffrage. Corporations. We don't think of corporations being involved in this fight, but they were very deeply. They feared that women voting might affect their bottom line negatively. The textile manufacturers, for instance, believed that women voters, mothers voting, might want to abolish child labor. And these factories were based upon cheap child labor and cheap women's labor. And they didn't want women anywhere near the vote to mess that up. The liquor industry also opposed suffrage and financed a lot of the anti-suffrage activities. And they feared, because women had often been associated with the temperance movement. Again, temperance for some was a moral issue, but for many it was a domestic violence issue. Women could not initiate civil suits against abusive husbands. They were not given that right in court. They couldn't testify in court. They could not serve on a jury. And so temperance has another meaning at this time in the 19th and early 20th century, to cut liquor at its source, and maybe that would give women more power. So women were associated with the temperance movement. Now, in the summer of 1920, prohibition's already in effect. It's law. It's being carried out. But what the liquor industry is hoping, that if they can keep women away from the ballot in 1920, well, maybe it won't be enforced quite so stringently. And so they're still working hard to keep women away from voting. And there's a rather humorous parts of the book that describe the liquor industry's activities in Nashville. They establish a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel, where everyone is staying, and it distributes liquor morning, noon, and night to any legislator who comes up. He'll be plied with liquor and given reasons why he should not ratify the amendment. It was called the Jack Daniels Suite. And there are great scenes in the book of legislators being dead drunk, bouncing off the walls, and they have to be thrown into the showers before they can go into the chamber to vote. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women might oppose their sisters getting the vote was really shocking to me when I first encountered it in my research. But you had to understand that many of these anti-suffragists were social and political and cultural conservatives who truly believed that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. It would endanger the American home and bring about what they called the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private life as well as public life, and that's what made it frightening. And I think this is an important reminder that the debate over women's suffrage was never just a political debate. It was also a social and cultural, and for some, a moral debate about the role of women in society. It was a precursor to what we now might call the culture wars. And that's what made it so complicated and so difficult. And here's one of my favorite anti-suffrage cartoons. This is called America When Feminized. And it's a little small, so I'll describe it to you. It's the hen is wearing a Votes for Women sash, and she has just walked off the nest. And the rooster calls after her, "Ma, the eggs are going to get cold." And she calls back, "Sit on 'em yourself, old man. My country calls me." And one of the taglines says, "A vote for the federal amendment is a vote for organized female nagging forever." So here you see the dangers involved. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings and fistfights, betrayal, courage. The newspapers call it Suffrage Armageddon. The outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience by the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. Now, all this took place just about a century ago. But I think you'll find that the story I tell has surprising and perhaps even unnervingly modern themes. It helps explain where we've been, but also where we are right now. It deals with topics that dominate our headlines today: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy, and racism. Because the story of women's suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. They want to keep it a white man's nation. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is flown in defiance. Here is a picture of the opening ceremonies of the anti-suffrage headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel in downtown Nashville. That's Josephine Pearson on your right, and a national anti-suffrage leader holding the stars and bars. And this is filled with all kinds of symbols that any Southerner would understand. I wrote this book before the 2016 election. In fact, I handed it in the day before the 2016 election, that Monday. I pushed the send button, which is how you send manuscripts in these days, and my editor in New York received it and said, "Great timing." Well, I think the timing has a different meaning now, because the story that I tell of the suffragists' long fight for democracy and the final battle in Nashville has taken on layers of meaning that I could not have anticipated. This history of women, of citizen activists fighting for their rights, enters a new dimension as rights that we've assumed have been secure. Voting rights, citizenship rights, press freedom, women's rights appear to be endangered once again. And this history of women political activists and leaders resonates as an historic number of women run for office at all levels, and more are serving in Congress now, 131, than ever before. There are important lessons to be learned from the fight for women's suffrage, and they are useful today. It teaches us that social change is slow and political change is hard, that the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It was not won in 1920, it was not over, and it's not complete today. While the 19th Amendment did give the vote to all women, Black women and men, Asian women and Native American women would have to wait decades longer to secure their voting rights. It also teaches us that reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is inspiring, but it's also a cautionary tale. It's complicated, It's messy. It's not a fairy tale. There are moral compromises made to achieve success, and we should learn from those mistakes. I hope the story I tell in the Women's Hour will teach a new generation of activists that protest is patriotic and necessary, but it must be followed by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and picket and protest. They debated and lobbied and drafted legislation and campaigned. And they did not rest after the 19th Amendment was secured. Carrie Catt established the League of Women Voters. And Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, which would be the next step in securing not just electoral rights, but all the other rights that women need for equality in our nation. And it's been 96 years since that was introduced into Congress, and it's still not ratified. Today, a century after the events of my book, there's still much work to be done. Voting rights are under siege, including here in New Hampshire. New Hampshire does not permit online voter registration or early voting or no excuse absentee voting, which really does help to get more people out to vote, make it easier. Recent laws enacted by the legislature make it harder to register and to vote, requiring photo ID, proof of New Hampshire residency for students, which has been likened to a poll tax, and a bipartisan effort to eliminate gerrymandering, to have citizen commissions to draw district lines, and which passed the legislature, was then vetoed by Governor Sununu. And unfortunately, New Hampshire is not alone in this attack on voting rights. In the past decade, 25 states have enacted harsh restrictions on voter participation, with a surge of suppression tactics emerging in 25 state houses after the Supreme Court's 2013 ruling that gutted enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Voting rights are not and must not be a partisan issue. They are a stress test measuring the health of our democracy. We must make it easier, not harder, to vote. And unfortunately, New Hampshire is failing this test. I think it's a sad mockery for all states to be celebrating the 19th Amendment's expansion of voting rights while slashing those voting rights today. We as a nation, and you as a state, must do better. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And today, our job is to protect the vote for all citizens, to finally make the words of the preamble of the US Constitution, "We the people," ring loud and ring true. Thank you very much.